It's nice to see the Plotkin Chapel completely full on this Shabbat, particularly in the summer. I have a feeling you thought that Oprah was giving away cars or something, but I suspect you're here for other reasons as well. As you know, one of the most critical issues facing the world has been headline news this week. The day before yesterday, the president announced that an agreement was reached with Iran regarding their pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Now, it's interesting, I have friends who are traveling overseas right now, one in Greece, for example, who said, it's not even in the news here. What's the big deal? But we Jews, we know exactly what the big deal is. Congress now has, I think, 60 days to review this agreement and decide to either accept it or reject it. They have this right, by the way, because of legislation called the Iran Nuclear Agreement Act, Review Act of 2015. You may remember it was a Corker-Menendez bill that was pushed through initially the Senate and then later the House of Representatives, a similar bill, which is a bipartisan bill giving Congress the opportunity to either accept or reject any agreement that was made. So what exactly are we to make of this? I want to tell you from the outset that there would be, well, nothing would give me more joy, and I assume most of us, to see a diplomatic solution to this issue. I strongly support America's attempt to lead the world in resolving this matter in a peaceful way. I've given hundreds of sermons in my career. You all know me pretty well. Don't advocate political activism almost ever. I reserve it for matters which I think are absolutely critical, and particularly matters which I think have a direct impact on Israel and the Middle East. And I want to tell you that I would like to share the enthusiasm of, say, USA Today, the newspaper which saw this agreement almost euphorically, calling it a new era. They're correct. It is a new era. But I fear they are not correct about what the era may become. My great concern is that this new era will be the era of a very strong Iran in the Middle East. Let's take a look at what Iran has already become, and this is not partisan. This is Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. This is something I think we all can agree on. Iran is the greatest sponsor of terrorism in the world today. So take a moment just to think about that. The greatest sponsor of terrorism in the world. Their money has been used by terror groups for bombings, for beheadings, for burning people alive, for the torture of men and women. The Iranian regime is in good part responsible for the death of some 200,000 innocent Syrians at the hands of this tyrant named Assad. You may know or you may not know what was happening in the streets of Iran during these negotiations which took place in Vienna. The government sponsored a demonstration. It was called the Death to America demonstration. The only demonstrations which take place in Iran are government-sponsored demonstrations. But of course, it's not only America. Nothing would give the leaders of the Iranian regime greater joy than to see the 7 million Jews of Israel destroyed. How do we know that? They continually remind us and continually remind the world. And there's one thing that I know about Israel's enemies. I believe them. I believe them. That's the regime that we are negotiating with. Anything that strengthens them, not only in the future, but even at this moment, has to be something that gives us great concern. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, carefully looked over the agreement and concluded that the proposed deal should not be accepted by Congress for a number of key reasons. I want to share some of their concerns with you with a little analysis about each of them. The first reason is because they think it will legitimize Iran as a nuclear threshold state. For the last 20 years, almost all of the international community objected to Iran's illicit nuclear growth. With this agreement, the objections end. The growth can continue, and when the restrictions are ultimately lifted, Iran will have the ability to produce enough fuel for a nuclear bomb probably within a month. The second concern that is raised by AIPAC is that they believe that this agreement raises the prospect of war. In other words, rather than lowering it, it makes it more likely, because if Iran becomes a nuclear threshold state, there is simply no way to stop the country peacefully. If it decides to build a nuclear weapon, the Middle East becomes far less stable, and the prospects for a large-scale war increase. The third concern that they raise is that this will spur a nuclear arms race. This would be catastrophic in the Middle East. The Arab world fears Iran. The Saudis are scared and desperately want to see Iran's nuclear growth stopped. Remarkably, in this agreement, there is no requirement to dismantle centrifuges in any Iranian nuclear facility. With the fear of Iran gaining a nuclear weapon heightened, Arab countries will do the thing that they need to do to defend themselves. They will start to either develop or purchase their own nuclear arsenals. To date, though it's not been publicly stated, there's an assumption that Israel is the only nuclear capability in the Middle East. That's why, by the way, one of the reasons that Israel has the peace that she has. Should surrounding countries begin a nuclear arms race, the potential is catastrophic. The fourth concern that AIPAC raises is that this proposed agreement lifts sanctions as soon as the agreement begins. In other words, rather than see if Iran complies and gradually lift the sanctions are lifted immediately. Why? Why? The sanctions were having a major impact on Iran's economy and much more. Once they're lifted, it would be virtually impossible to get the nations of the world to implement them again. And finally, their fifth concern is that they believe that this will increase Iranian support of terrorism. This, to me, is actually the most frightening because it's immediate. The proposed agreement will give Iran power to continue doing exactly what they have been doing in the world, but only to a far greater extent. They will be receiving somewhere between 100 and 150 billion dollars, and virtually all of their economic, financial, and energy sanctions will be released. So take a moment and reflect on what you think they'll do with that 100 to 150 billion dollars. You think they'll put their money into school lunch programs? Do you think maybe they'll create other social programs or increase unemployment benefits for the unemployed in Iran? Do you think it'll go to humanitarian causes like women's rights or equal rights for gays? Or, based on what you know about this regime, do you think the money will further be used to extinguish human rights within the country, fund more terror, give more weapons to Hezbollah and Hamas, and bring them closer to their goal of destroying Israel and destroying America? In short, if this agreement is accepted by Congress, AIPAC and others fear, and I have this fear as well, that not only will we have bailed out the most horrible regime, arguably the most horrible regime in the world, we will have helped them to become more effective terrorists. I decided to read what was told to the citizens of Iran about the agreement the day after the agreement was reached. These are the words of Iran's President Rouhani. This is what he said to the Iranian people, quote, "The international community is moving the sanctions and Iran is keeping its nuclear program." They also reported that none of our nuclear facilities will be dismantled. We can continue to enrich uranium. We can continue our work on their centrifuges. And it's all true. Almost all of Iran's nuclear infrastructure will remain intact. No wonder they agreed. Did you know that this agreement does not include surprise inspections? Can you imagine? If we suspect that Iran has launched a covert nuclear operation, the agreement states that we have to give the Iranian government 24 days advance notice before we can inspect it. This is equivalent to the police suspecting that there's a methamphetamine lab being built somewhere, and they have to tell the drug dealers that we'll be seeing you in 24 days before we come to inspect. So just imagine how this works. Someone in the United States picks up the phone and they call a representative of the Iran regime. "Hi, President Rouhani, we think we are building a nuclear bomb underground 30 miles southwest of Tehran. Today is July 17th, but because we're abiding by the agreement, we want you to know that on August 11th, we'll be popping in to check it out." I'm not exaggerating. That's in the agreement. You can imagine the discussions that went on in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament. The proposed agreement was, of course, front and center. As you know, there is hardly anything upon which Israelis universally agree. To get Israelis to universally agree, if you said to them, ham is not kosher, it would be up for debate. There is nothing that they can universally agree upon. Netanyahu opposes it. Opposition leader Herzog of the Labor Party opposes it. Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid opposes it. And these are his words, by the way. "We thought this deal would be bad. It's even worse. This is a bad day for the Jewish people, a bad day for the state of Israel, and a black day for the world." There are alternatives. Iran has been crippled by sanctions. And these sanctions, by the way, are only a few years old. Nobody is proposing war. But rather than giving in on virtually every crucial measure, we should continue to increase every sanction we can and bring the world together to further strangle their economy. It would be easier. Sure, Congress can ratify this proposed agreement. And for many Americans, there'll be a sense of relief. We can remove this concern and go on with our lives. For a while, we won't be thinking about a nuclear Iran, and the drought can return to the front pages of the Los Angeles Times. It's happened before. The world has had that false sense of comfort. September 30th, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain walked out declaring peace for our time. By the way, it's peace for our time, not peace in our time. That was after the Munich Agreement. And the world felt very good after Chamberlain's declaration. People went on with their lives. And less than a year later, Europe was immersed in World War II. 55 million people died. Imagine if Hitler, Yamach Shemo, his name should be erased, had been stopped in 1938. In the coming weeks, senators and congressmen and women will have to make a decision whether or not to approve this agreement. Some of us will be going to Washington by invitation to meet with them. What exactly should we say? Here's what I might say. Mr. or Mrs. Senator or Mr. and Mrs. Mr. Congressman, you have the potential deal in your hands. You have heard arguments from people far better politically equipped than we. So let me speak to you from the heart. You are entrusted with the safety of our nation, and America in many ways is entrusted with the stability of the world. When you make your decision, when you decide whether or not to accept this agreement, I ask that you keep in mind that we are all students of history. We have experienced the ending of the most violent century in history. If there is one thing that we have learned, given the horrors of the last century, from Mao Zedong to Pol Pot, from Hitler to Stalin, if there's one thing we should have all learned, it is that the unimaginable must be imagined. The unimaginable can happen. And as Jews, we don't have to imagine it. It happened. Nothing would give the leaders of Iran greater joy to destroy, to incinerate the 7 million Jews of Israel. And nothing would give them greater joy than to destroy America and all that she stands for. Members of Congress, I ask you indeed most respectfully, I implore you, do not allow the most evil regime in the world to obtain the most powerful weapon of destruction ever known to humanity. My friends, this is a critical moment in world history. May God bless our leaders with wisdom and, perhaps equally important, with courage. And to those of you tonight, may you be blessed with a Shabbat Shalom.